A poor beggar woman offered her last few coins to pay for the taxi of a lost man, not knowing he was a millionaire. 2 days later, he finds her and takes an action that brings the woman to tears. Claire had long since stopped counting the winters. Each year in Philadelphia felt colder than the last, and this one, with its biting wind and slate-grey skies, seemed determined to remind her how unforgiving the world could be. She sat at her usual spot, on the corner of 18th Street, just across from a busy coffee shop where people passed by in hurried steps, sipping lattes and barely glancing her way. Her blanket, frayed at the edges, was pulled tightly around her shoulders, and her belongings, a battered backpack, a worn-out book, and a paper cup with coins, sat beside her like silent sentinels. That morning she had exactly $2 in coins. $2 scraped together from yesterday's kindness, a stranger who had dropped a quarter with a quiet "God bless," and a little girl who insisted on giving Claire a dollar bill from her own allowance. Claire had wanted to cry then, but she simply smiled and said thank you, knowing it was all she had for food that day. As she sat there watching the city pulse around her, a man in a dark overcoat and leather shoes appeared near the corner, looking wildly out of place. He was clean-shaven, handsome in a polished way, with a phone in his hand and panic in his eyes. He kept glancing around, then back to his phone, typing quickly, sighing, and looking again. Claire watched him for a while. Something about his anxious movements tugged at her. Then he spoke, not to her at first, but to no one in particular. "Does anyone know where the train entrance is? I can't miss this. Damn, I can't miss this." Claire's voice came before she realized she had spoken. "You're not from around here, are you?" He turned, startled, his eyes locked on hers, and for a moment, his frantic expression softened as if the simple human connection had thrown him off balance. "No, I lost my wallet. My phone's about to die. I have a meeting across town in 20 minutes and I can't get a taxi. No cash, nothing." Claire nodded slowly, pushing herself to her feet. Her fingers trembled as she reached into the paper cup, gathering the coins, the $2 she had hoped to use for something warm later. Without saying a word, she stepped into the street and waved down a cab. The driver rolled down his window. "Where to?" Claire gestured to the man. "He needs to get across town. Midtown, probably." "I don't have any," the man started. She cut him off gently. "I know. I heard. I've got it." She placed the coins into the driver's hand and looked at him with an intensity that defied her worn clothes and tangled hair. "Please, just take him." The cabbie hesitated, glanced between them, then shrugged. "All right, lady, if you say so." The man was stunned. "I can't let you. Today it's you," Claire said, her voice quiet but firm. "Tomorrow maybe it's me." She turned away before he could argue, already stepping back to her corner. The man hesitated, then climbed into the taxi. As the car pulled away, he looked back through the window. Claire was already sitting again, curling into her blanket as if the moment had passed. But he couldn't take his eyes off her. Something had just happened, something he couldn't quite explain. The cab turned the corner, disappearing into the flow of traffic, but the image of her, sitting there with nothing, giving the last of what she had, remained burned into his mind. He didn't know her name, he didn't know why she had done it, but he knew one thing for sure: he would not forget her. Michael Turner couldn't stop replaying the moment in his head. The cab hummed beneath him as the city moved past in fast blurs of motion. Buildings, crosswalks, pedestrians who didn't know or care what had just happened. But all Michael could think about was the woman. Her coat had been too thin for the weather. Her fingers trembled not just from cold, but from the vulnerability of parting with something that mattered. $2. What was that to someone like him? A forgettable tip, a momentary transaction, but for her it was a sacrifice. And not just any sacrifice, but a willing one, made with no expectation, no hesitation. She had given it freely, simply because he needed it more. The driver had asked again for the destination, snapping Michael out of his daze. "Corner of Chestnut and Broad," he had said automatically, 15 minutes. But his thoughts refused to settle. As the car weaved through traffic, Michael stared out the back window, his eyes drawn toward the direction they had come. He imagined her already back on the sidewalk, hugging herself against the chill, her paper cup emptier than before. It haunted him, the way she had stepped forward without question, without judgment, as if for just that moment she had seen him not as someone above her, but as someone equally human. Equally lost. By the time he arrived at the development site, the wind had picked up, slicing between the buildings with sharp precision. The meeting was still waiting for him, architects, contractors, city officials, but Michael could hardly focus. He went through the motions, nodded where appropriate, offered commentary on steel frames and zoning issues, but his mind was elsewhere. He had built luxury condominiums and multi-million-dollar properties. He had a penthouse in New York, another in San Francisco. But never, not once, had he encountered someone who gave without wanting anything back, not like she did. Hours later, as the sun dipped low and the city softened into evening, Michael sat alone at the window of his hotel suite. The skyline glittered beyond the glass, impressive and vast, but he felt small. Not because of the view or the height, but because somewhere down there a woman who had nothing had given everything for him, and he had done nothing in return. He barely slept that night. When morning came, he dressed quickly, no suit this time, just jeans and a warm jacket. He left the hotel before breakfast and walked the dozen blocks back to the corner of 18th Street. He hoped, naively perhaps, that she would be there again, maybe sitting against the same brick wall, maybe sipping a coffee someone had offered. But the corner was empty. The wind blew trash in slow spirals, and the crowd flowed past, indifferent, as ever. He waited for over an hour, pacing up and down the block, asking a few of the other homeless individuals if they had seen a woman named Claire. He had learned her name only because one of the men had mentioned it in passing. "The one with the blue blanket?" the man had asked, scratching his beard. "She don't come every day. Sometimes she disappears for a while. You looking for her?" "Yes," Michael had said quickly. "Do you know where she stays?" "Where she sleeps," the man shrugged. "Could be the shelter down on Vine or the church basement on Walnut, sometimes the train station when it's too full." Michael thanked him and moved on, but the ache in his chest deepened. The city was too big. Claire was a ghost, slipping between cracks that had swallowed countless others, and he, despite his wealth, his power, his connections, had no idea how to find her. He stopped for coffee at a food truck on the corner and asked the vendor if he had seen her. The man leaned on the counter and squinted. "You mean Claire?" "Yeah. She was around 2 nights ago, came by asking for leftover soup. Gave her some." "Sure." Said she was headed toward the shelter on Spruce Street, but she didn't come back yesterday. Lot of folks don't. Streets swallow 'em. "Did she say anything? Was she sick? Cold?" Michael pressed. "She was coughing, man," the vendor replied. "Looked tired, real tired. Told her to get some rest, but..." He trailed off with a shrug. Michael felt the knot in his stomach tighten, coughing, exhaustion. Claire had looked fragile, yes, but he hadn't noticed any signs of illness. Or maybe he had, and chose to ignore them in the moment. After all, he had been the one in crisis. She had been the savior. How ironic. He spent the rest of the day moving between shelters. Some recognized her name, some didn't. Those who did spoke of her gently, with the kind of respect earned by kindness, not by position. "She doesn't beg much," one volunteer said. "Just sits quiet. Helps new folks find a spot to sleep. When it's crowded, she doesn't ask for much, never does." Another woman, older, wearing a red scarf and carrying bags of donated clothes, shook her head. "Claire's always drifting. If she finds a spot to rest, it's never for long. Says the city makes her anxious. Too many memories, she says." Michael asked if they had any record of her, any way to contact her. "No ID, no phone, nothing," the volunteer replied. "She's one of the forgotten ones. Hard to hold on to someone like that." As night approached, Michael stood at a crosswalk near one of the shelters, watching the faces that passed, hoping hers might appear. It didn't. Instead, he found himself speaking again to a man in a wool cap, wrapped in 3 coats, seated near a trash bin behind the shelter. "You looking for Claire?" the man asked. "Yes. She used to leave letters," the man said, pointing at the bin. "Crazy thing, right? She writes them on napkins, receipts, whatever she can find. Says it helps her remember who she is." Michael knelt beside the bin. He hesitated, then reached in. It smelled of old coffee and damp cardboard, but buried. Beneath the debris was a plastic bag, knotted at the top. Inside were folded slips of paper, some stained, others torn. One was written on the back of an old diner receipt, another on a yellowed napkin. He took them carefully, reading each word, and then he found it, a note that made his breath catch. "To the future that may never come," it began. The handwriting was shaky but clear. "I don't know if I'll ever matter to anyone, but today I gave away my last $2. Maybe that was foolish, or maybe it was the only thing that kept me human. If I disappear, if no one sees me again, let this be proof that I tried. That I cared, that I wanted to be remembered as someone who did one good thing." Michael sat there in silence, the weight of the words settling over him like snowfall. He folded the note with care, slid it into his jacket pocket, and stood. The night deepened around him, but he was no longer lost. He had a mission, and her name was Claire. The early morning light filtered weakly through the clouds, painting Philadelphia in a pale, uncertain glow. Michael Turner stood at the intersection of Vine and 12th, clutching a wrinkled napkin inscribed with Claire's trembling script. Her words had followed him through the night, echoing in his thoughts louder than the hum of the hotel's central heating or the distant sirens that lulled the city to sleep. "Let this be proof that I tried." That line, it had lodged itself into his chest like a thorn. He had made a decision before sunrise. He would find her. Not because he owed her, though in many ways he did, but because something in her act had cracked open a part of him he thought long since sealed. She had given her last $2 to a stranger without knowing his name, his story, or his wealth. Now he needed to return the gesture, not with money, but with presence, with action, with care. The first place he checked was the Spruce Street shelter. The receptionist, a thin woman with dark circles under her eyes and a clipboard always in motion, paused when he said Claire's name. "She comes and goes," she said, pushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "Was here last Tuesday, took a cot, stayed quiet, didn't eat much. Then she was gone by morning." Michael pressed for more. Had she said anything, left anything behind? The woman sighed. "Claire's one of the ones that slips between systems. No ID, no case file. We don't even have a last name. She doesn't cause trouble, so nobody keeps tabs." Michael offered a generous donation on the spot, not as a bribe, but as a way of helping others like her. Still, the woman had no new leads, just one suggestion. "Try the subway terminals," she said. "Sometimes they sleep down there when it gets crowded up here." Michael walked the city on foot. Every terminal, every bench, every hidden corner became part of his grid. He asked conductors, janitors, vendors. Most shook their heads. A few remembered a woman with a blue blanket, coughing hard, limping slightly. "Didn't look so good," one security guard had said at the Walnut Street station. "We called someone when she collapsed near the benches." The word collapsed made Michael's blood run cold. "Where did they take her?" he asked, voice tight. "Hospital, probably, municipal. They handled cases like that." Michael turned immediately toward Broad Street. The Philadelphia Municipal Hospital loomed like an old memory, worn, busy, underfunded. He entered through the emergency wing, where the halls buzzed with overworked nurses and the scent of antiseptic. At the reception desk, he gave her name again. "Claire," the clerk repeated, typing with long red nails. "No last name?" "No, she's homeless. Thin brown hair, mid-40s maybe, wearing a blue blanket." The woman clicked her tongue. "Hang on." A pause, more typing. Then, "Yeah, someone brought in a Jane Doe 2 nights ago. No ID, severe pneumonia. Found unconscious in the subway." Michael's stomach clenched. "Is she here?" "Room 12, second floor. She's in isolation." He didn't wait. The hallway leading to the room was cold and clinical, lined with beds and drawn curtains. He stopped outside room 12 and took a breath. Inside, Claire lay still under a white sheet, an oxygen tube beneath her nose, her cheeks pale and sunken. She looked smaller somehow, more fragile. The strong woman who had stopped a taxi and offered her last $2 was now reduced to quiet breaths and hospital beeping. Michael stepped inside and sat at her bedside. He didn't speak at first. He just looked at her as if memorizing her face would make the guilt less sharp. He had searched every corner of the city, but this was not how he had imagined finding her. He had pictured her smiling, maybe surprised, maybe even laughing at the absurdity of a millionaire chasing a homeless woman through Philadelphia. But not this, not the stillness, the tubes, the silence. He reached for her hand. It was cold, but not lifeless. He held it gently, as if any pressure might wake her too soon, or not at all. For a long moment he said nothing. Then finally, he whispered, "You saved me. You didn't know it, but you did. And now I'm here, I'm not leaving." Nurses came and went. Some glanced at him with curiosity, but none asked him to leave. He told them he was a relative. They didn't question it. He stayed all afternoon, reading from the notes she had left behind, the little letters found in the trash, now folded carefully in his pocket. He read them aloud, even if she couldn't hear. "You wrote that you wanted to matter to someone," he said softly. "Well, you matter to me." Outside the window, the city buzzed on, unaware of what was unfolding in this tiny, sterile room. But inside, something was shifting. A man who had spent his life building towers of glass and steel was now anchoring himself to the fragile hope of one woman's recovery. By evening, Claire stirred. Michael sat upright, her eyes fluttered, unfocused at first, then sharper. She looked around, confused, weak. When she saw him, she tried to pull away, alarmed. "Who?" she began, voice barely a whisper. "It's okay," Michael said quickly. "You're safe, you're in the hospital." She stared at him, uncertain. "Why are you here?" Michael smiled gently. "You helped me. Now I'm helping you." Her eyes filled with tears before she even understood what those words meant. The hospital room had grown darker as the sun faded, and yet Michael remained seated, his posture rigid, his expression composed only on the surface. Claire had drifted back into sleep not long after their brief exchange, her body still frail, lungs rattling softly with each breath, despite the oxygen support. A nurse had come in to check her vitals and suggested he get some rest, but Michael refused. He had spent the last 48 hours searching the city with only an old receipt and a few names to guide him. Now that she was here, real, breathing, alive, he wasn't going anywhere. He thought again about the first time he saw her, sitting beneath that building's shadow on 18th Street, clutching her paper cup like it was the last thing tethering her to this world. And in some strange, poetic way it had been. That cup had been the vessel through which she poured her final bit of hope, not for herself, but for someone else. When morning came, Claire was still asleep. Michael stepped out to grab coffee, and returned with a plain cup and a warm muffin, unsure if she'd be strong enough to eat, but unwilling to assume she wouldn't want the option. He sat beside her again, just watching, thinking. Not about money or contracts or properties, but about her, the mysterious, generous, broken woman who had so willingly handed him her last $2. By noon, a doctor finally approached. "Mr. Turner." "Yes," Michael answered quickly, standing. "I understand you've been here most of the night." "I have," he said. The doctor nodded. "She's stable for now. Pneumonia, likely from prolonged exposure and malnutrition. Her immune system is severely compromised. If she hadn't been found when she was, I doubt she would have lasted another day." Michael felt the words settle on him like cold iron. The guilt was irrational. He hadn't known she was in danger, but it clung to him nonetheless. He should have done more. He should have acted sooner. "She doesn't have any identification," the doctor continued. "No records. We listed her as Jane Doe until you gave us a name." "She's Claire," Michael said, his voice firmer than before. "I don't know her last name, but I'm sure it's her." The doctor nodded slowly. "Once she regains full consciousness, we'll need to run a few cognitive assessments. Her recovery won't be just physical. People in her condition often struggle with trust, memory, and emotional regulation." Michael glanced toward the room. "Can I stay?" The doctor hesitated only a second. "As long as she's comfortable with it." Later that evening, Claire awoke again. This time she stayed alert longer, Her eyes studied Michael carefully, as if trying to extract a motive from the way he sat or the sound of his breathing. Her voice, when it came, was dry but curious. "You're the man from the corner," she said slowly. Michael nodded. "You gave me your last $2. She blinked. "I didn't know who you were." "I know," he said. "You helped me anyway." Claire looked away then, out the window. "Why? Why what? Why are you here?" He answered without pause. "Because you didn't walk away when I needed help, and now you need someone." Silence followed. She didn't argue, didn't accept. She just turned her face back toward the window and said, "You shouldn't get involved with people like me." Michael leaned forward. "Why not?" "Because people like me disappear. We vanish between shelters and sidewalks. We get sick, we sleep in train stations, and no one comes looking. You don't rescue people like me. You forget them." His chest tightened at her words, not because they were harsh, but because they were true. Or they had been until now. "I'm not going to forget you," he said. She didn't answer, but her hand, resting limply on the sheet, twitched slightly toward his. A gesture barely perceptible, but real, and that was enough. The following days were a blur of medical updates and quiet conversations. Claire remained distant but civil. She answered when spoken to, accepted food, allowed the nurses to care for her. But she never spoke of her past. Michael didn't press. He had learned from the doctors that people in her condition often needed time to unlearn their survival mechanisms. Silence had been her armor. It wasn't going to fall overnight. But then came the day she asked a question. "Why did you come back?" Michael had been reading beside her bed when she spoke. He looked up. "Because I couldn't stop thinking about you." "Me?" Her brow furrowed. "Why me?" He considered that. "Because you did something most people wouldn't. You didn't know who I was, but you helped me anyway. I guess I couldn't walk away from that." She watched him quietly, lips pressed in a thin line. "I didn't do it for a reward." "I know. I just didn't want to feel invisible. Not that day." Her voice cracked on the last word. Michael reached for her hand again, and this time she let him. Outside, the city pulsed as it always had. Cars, crowds, distant horns. But within that hospital room, something fragile was forming. Not trust, not yet. But the first layer of something deeper, recognition. A flicker of belief that maybe, just maybe, someone cared enough not to walk away. And for Michael Turner, a man who had once believed in nothing but numbers and concrete, that flicker was worth more than any deal he had ever closed. The day Claire was deemed stable enough to be moved from the isolation wing to a shared recovery room, the sky outside the hospital was an undisturbed grey. Rain had fallen earlier, now reduced to a cold mist clinging to the windows. Michael walked beside her wheelchair, silent but present. Claire didn't speak either, allowing the nurse to guide her through the corridor as if the act of being escorted itself was foreign, unsettling. Her eyes never met his, but Michael didn't mind. Each step she took was a victory in itself, each breath a sign she was still willing to exist. When they reached the new room, Claire was helped into bed and left alone for a while. Michael remained, seated in the corner, observing, never imposing. A tray of bland hospital food rested untouched by the window. She had no appetite, but he had learned not to coax. She needed control over her space, her choices, her story. Late that afternoon, when the room had fallen into a calm silence, Claire broke it with a faint whisper. "I used to write letters." Michael turned toward her. "To someone?" She shook her head. "No, just letters, notes, things I couldn't say out loud." "Did you ever send them?" Her eyes stayed on the wall. "Never. There was no one to send them to, but it made me feel like I wasn't fading completely, like parts of me were still trying to live, even if no one was looking." Michael didn't respond immediately. He remembered the ones he had found near the dumpster, the folded scraps of memory, of pain, of dreams never spoken. In particular, one line had etched itself into his memory with cruel permanence. "If I disappear for good, Maybe someone will find this and remember that. I tried. Claire's voice came again, distant. I thought if someone read them, they'd know I wasn't just another lost body on the sidewalk, that I had thoughts, that I tried to be kind. Michael stood slowly, reached into the inside pocket of his coat, and withdrew the worn plastic bag containing the salvaged letters. He crossed the room and placed it gently on the blanket covering her lap. Claire looked down, puzzled. Then her breath hitched as she recognized the faded corners, the torn diner receipt with its ink smudged by time and weather. "Are you found these?" she asked, her voice suddenly small. Michael nodded. "They were in a trash bin behind the shelter. A man told me you used to leave them there." She didn't touch the bag at first, just stared at it, as if afraid that contents might burn her. Then slowly, with trembling fingers, she opened it and pulled out one of the letters. Her eyes scanned the words she herself had written, words she hadn't thought anyone would ever see. Tears slipped down her cheeks, silent and uninvited. "I forgot I wrote this," she murmured. "This one was after I lost the last shelter. Bed to a woman with kids. I didn't even argue. Just went back to the station and tried to sleep behind a bench." Michael said nothing. He sat beside her and waited, letting the stillness do the work of healing. Claire read another letter, then another, until her hands shook too much to hold them. "They weren't supposed to mean anything," she said. "They were just pieces of me I left behind so the city wouldn't erase me completely." He leaned in. "They meant something. They still do. You thought no one saw you, but I did. And now I can't look away." Claire met his eyes for the first time since waking up in the hospital. There was no defiance in her gaze, only raw vulnerability, the kind that could not be hidden beneath sarcasm or silence. She wasn't used to being seen, and it terrified her. But it also, in some inexplicable way, gave her strength. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, not accusatory, but sincerely. You're not like me. You're not supposed to be here." "I'm here because you reminded me who I used to be," he said softly. "Before the boardrooms, before the deadlines and the towers with my name on them. You reminded me that being human doesn't come with a price tag." Claire looked away again, blinking hard. "You don't even know my whole story." "I don't need to. I know the most important part." "What part is that?" "That when I was lost, you gave everything you had to help a stranger. That tells me everything I need to know." A heavy silence settled between them, but it was no longer empty. It was filled with an unspoken understanding, a bond formed not by shared experience, but by a rare moment of unfiltered truth. That evening, when Michael left the hospital to return to his hotel, he didn't go straight to bed. Instead, he sat by the window overlooking the skyline and took out a notepad from his briefcase. For the first time in years, he began to write. Not numbers, not proposals or emails, but a letter. Not to anyone in particular, just words, thoughts, memories, inspired by the woman in the hospital bed who wrote letters to no one and ended up changing someone's world. He titled it, "To the One Who Didn't Walk Away." Meanwhile, back at the hospital, Claire slept with the plastic bag of letters tucked beneath her pillow. For the first time in a long while, she dreamed not of cold benches or dark alleys, but of words, her own words, being held in someone else's hands. And in that dream, she was not invisible. She was heard. She was remembered. She mattered. 3 days had passed since Claire was moved to recovery. And although her physical condition showed steady improvement, there remained something elusive in her emotional state. A kind of half-trust, half-detachment that Michael recognized but couldn't yet fully penetrate. She spoke more often, sometimes asked for news from outside, once even accepted a second helping of the hospital's bland oatmeal without Michael needing to suggest it. But each step forward came tempered with a glance over her shoulder, like she was expecting everything to vanish without warning. Michael didn't press her for details. She had offered fragments of her past, mentions of shelters, of nights spent at the 30th Street station, of other people she once knew, but they came disjointed, delivered in a tone that suggested she had rehearsed letting go of them long ago. Still, he knew the more she spoke, the more real her presence became, not just to him, but to herself. But Michael, too, was burdened with his own questions, questions that hadn't faded since the day he had found her unconscious. One had begun to circle in his mind more urgently than the others. What if he hadn't found her? What if no one had called for help at the station? The answer was simple and brutal. Claire would have died. Quietly, like thousands do, forgotten within the folds of a city that had no time to stop and look. That question ignited something deeper in Michael, something practical. He needed to know how close she had come to vanishing. He needed to see. The next morning, while Claire slept, he reached out to the private security team that oversaw some of his company's construction sites in Philadelphia. One of the terminals she mentioned, Arch Street Station, was within walking distance of a mixed-use tower his firm had under development. That building, like most of his company's active sites, had surveillance equipment, some of which included public footage that extended into the adjacent sidewalks and metro entrances. He didn't explain much, just requested that the surveillance unit retrieve any footage between the hours of 8 o'clock at night and 5 in the morning over a 3-day window. Specifically the stairwells, the main concourse, and the benches near the lower platforms. When the video came in, Michael watched it alone in his hotel room. The footage was grainy but clear enough to identify movement. Dozens of people, commuters, night workers, security guards, others like Claire, wandering in and out of frame. Some huddled in corners, some passed through in silence. And then, at 3:27 in the morning on the second day, he saw her. Claire appeared at the edge of the frame, dragging a duffel bag that barely held together, wrapped in what looked like the same blue blanket she had when they met. She moved slowly, hunched forward, as if each step carried the weight of weeks. She paused near a bench and tried to sit, but the cough hit her hard and sudden. In the footage, he could see her lurch forward, clutching her side. No one turned, no one flinched. She stayed that way, bent, coughing, then slumped sideways, onto the bench. A man passed by, looked at her, then looked away. Another, a woman in a janitor's uniform, glanced over but kept moving. For nearly 20 minutes she remained there, curled against the bench's metal edge, shaking. Only when a transit officer walked through and paused beside her did help arrive. The footage ended with the officer speaking into a radio and kneeling beside her. Michael watched the clip again and again. With each replay, his hands gripped the arms of the chair tighter. He saw not only Claire, but a system that failed her, a city that had forgotten her until her body forced it to remember. No one should be invisible while dying in plain sight. The next day, he returned to the hospital with a flash drive in his pocket. He didn't show Claire, not yet. He wasn't sure what good it would do to share something that painful, even if it had a moment of salvation at the end. Instead, he brought her a book, a worn copy of Great Expectations, one she had mentioned reading as a teenager. She smiled faintly when she saw it. "I used to read by flashlight in the shelter," she said. "Miss Havisham made me laugh. She was tragic, but at least she had lace." Michael chuckled. "You've got more fight in you than Miss Havisham." Heather did. She opened the book and began flipping through the pages, letting her fingers rest on a chapter without reading. "There's something strange about seeing the past come back," she said softly. He didn't ask what she meant, but he understood. After lunch, when she had fallen asleep again, he met with a hospital administrator in the lobby. He explained Claire's situation, not everything, but enough. He offered to cover all remaining medical costs, including follow-up appointments, prescriptions, and any transitional housing program they could recommend. The administrator, surprised by the generosity, asked if Claire had family who would assist. "I don't think she has anyone," Michael said, "but she's not alone anymore." That night, he watched the video one last time. But now he saw something different, not just the collapse, the suffering, the abandonment, but the moment the officer finally knelt beside her, the point at which someone decided she was worth stopping for. That was the turning point. And Michael knew then that he couldn't just be the man who showed up once. He had to be the one who stayed, not to save her, but to remind her every day that she never again had to disappear into silence. The sterile corridors of the Philadelphia Municipal Hospital were lined with soft beeps, occasional shuffles of nurses' shoes, and the quiet murmur of overhead intercoms announcing codes that most civilians couldn't decipher. But to Claire, the environment was a dull hum at the edge of her perception, White walls, grey skies outside the window, the scent of alcohol-based sanitizer lingering in the air. It all blended into a blur of sameness. Yet in that sameness, something had begun to change. A subtle shift in the temperature of her world. She was no longer invisible. Michael visited every day, sometimes twice. He no longer wore his designer coats or perfectly tailored suits. Instead, he arrived in a simple sweater, jeans, and worn sneakers. If Claire noticed the wardrobe shift, she never mentioned it. But Michael knew it mattered. Not just the visits, but the way he made himself smaller, less corporate, more human. He was a man trying to meet her on level ground, not save her from above. The nurses had started calling him Mr. Turner less often, switching instead to her friend or the guy with the coffee. He brought one every morning, black, strong, no sugar, just the way Claire had taken it back when she could afford preferences. Now she took it with gratitude and a bit of caution, still unsure whether this daily ritual was a passing kindness or something more permanent. One morning, as she sat in bed watching the sky outside tint pink with dawn, Michael arrived with coffee in one hand and a small bag of cinnamon muffins in the other. He didn't speak right away. He knew better now. Claire appreciated silence, the way some people appreciated music. She used it to orient herself, to reclaim parts of her that had been battered by years of neglect. Eventually she spoke. "I remember this one time, about a year ago. I was near City Hall sitting by that statue of the man with the hat. I don't even know who he is. I had half a sandwich. A kid, maybe 10, saw me eating. He was hungry too. I gave him the other half." Michael nodded, listening without interruption. His mom came back and yelled at him, said I was dangerous, told him never to take food from people like me. She paused. "I wasn't mad, I was just tired." Michael's voice was quiet. "What happened after that?" "I gave the rest of the sandwich to a pigeon," she said with a dry laugh. "At least he didn't judge me." It wasn't bitterness in her tone, more resignation, a resignation Michael had heard often enough to recognize. It was the kind that took years to build. It came from accumulating too many moments when the world told you your existence was a problem, your presence a disruption, your kindness a threat. But in that moment, Michael did something he hadn't done yet. He stood, walked to her bedside, and knelt beside her chair. "You don't owe anyone an apology for surviving," he said, "or for being good in a world that didn't know how to see you." She looked at him then, truly looked. Her eyes held no tears, but they held something deeper, a question unspoken. Why me? That same day, after her second physical therapy session, a young nurse brought her a folder. Inside were printouts, schedules, pamphlets, and an application for a transitional care facility downtown. It was a clean, small complex that took in recovering patients who had no homes to return to but didn't require hospitalization anymore. Claire glanced through it once, then set it aside. Michael watched her from across the room. "What do you think?" She shrugged. "Looks fine." "Just fine." "I don't know. I've been through programs before. They always come with expectations. Stay here, follow this, don't go there. Eventually I mess up one rule and I'm out." "This one doesn't operate like that," Michael said. "I called them. They take in people who just need time. Time to remember how to feel safe again." Claire turned her face away. "I don't know if I even remember how that feels." "I think you will," he said. She didn't answer. But that night, she filled out the application. The next few days brought more improvement. Her cough had lessened. She began eating full meals. Once Michael found her sitting upright, legs over the edge of the bed, rereading Great Expectations under the soft light of the window. She didn't say it, but the way her fingers traced the corners of the pages told him she was anchoring herself to something solid. Then one morning she asked, "Can we go outside?" Michael, surprised but delighted, helped her into a wheelchair. A nurse gave the all-clear for a brief excursion into the hospital garden. It was a small square of green, surrounded by brick walls, with a fountain in the middle and a few benches lining the path. Claire sat there for a long time, eyes closed, face tilted toward the sun. "I forgot what warmth felt like," she said. Michael didn't interrupt. She continued, When you sleep on metal benches long enough, your bones forget the difference between cold and pain. "Do you want to talk about that?" he asked. She opened her eyes. "Not now, but maybe soon." That was enough. As the week drew to a close, Claire was approved for discharge to the transitional facility. Michael handled the paperwork, ensured she would have a private room, paid for 3 months in advance. When he informed Claire, she only said, 3 months is a long time. It's time for you to rest without looking over your shoulder." She stared at the discharge papers. "And if I can't figure out how to live in that time, then we figure it out together." They sat in silence for a while longer, and just before he left for the evening, Claire whispered, "Thank you for not giving up on a stranger." Michael looked back at her with something close to awe. "You were never just a stranger," he said. "You were the first person in a long time who reminded me how to be human." And for the first time since he had met her, Claire smiled, not the small hesitant twitch of her lips. She gave nurses out of politeness, but a real smile, warm and fragile and full of unspoken truths. She was still rebuilding, but now she was no longer doing it alone. The air inside the transitional housing center was warm, but to Claire, it felt like stepping into a space that wasn't hers. The walls were painted in soft tones, beige and pale green, as if color could create safety, but she didn't feel safe. Not yet. The hallway smelled of old wood, lavender cleaning supplies, and something else, maybe unfamiliarity. Each room had a small bed, a chair, a nightstand, a lamp, with a switch too high for someone half asleep to reach easily. Hers was at the end of the hall, near a window that faced a quiet street. The blinds were half drawn, casting the room in filtered light that made everything feel slightly unreal. Michael helped her settle in. He placed her worn duffel bag on the bed and stood back, waiting for a signal that she wanted him to stay longer. Claire didn't give one. She walked to the window, looked out, and said nothing. For a moment he considered filling the silence, offering something, encouragement, a joke, reassurance. But instead, he left a paper bag on the nightstand and turned toward the door. "I'll come by tomorrow," he said. "Let me know if you need anything." She nodded, not looking at him. Michael left the door open behind him, deliberately. The gesture was meant to suggest freedom, that she could choose to close it when she was ready, not because someone told her to. When she was alone, Claire opened the bag. Inside were a fresh notebook and a pen, a copy of Great Expectations with a new bookmark, and a small card with a handwritten note. "You are not a burden. You are someone worth the time." She stared at it for a long time before tucking it into the drawer. The first night she didn't sleep. She lay on the bed, shoes still on, fully clothed. Her body braced against the softness of the mattress. It was too much, too quiet. She missed the hard familiarity of concrete and noise, the world she had adapted to, where she was invisible, but at least knew the rules. The next day, Michael returned. He brought lunch and conversation, neither of which she accepted easily. She kept her answers short, her eyes distant. He noticed, of course, but didn't push. Instead, he spoke about the city, how some developers were pushing for new green spaces, how the mayor was being challenged by community organizers demanding better housing. He talked about things that mattered without sounding like he was trying to teach her, just speaking like a friend. Claire listened, but she said little. When he finally stood to leave, she surprised herself by asking, "Why me?" Michael turned slowly, surprised but calm. "Because you didn't turn away from me when I needed help. That was just $2. It was everything you had." She said nothing more, but she didn't close the door when he left. The days passed, one folding into another. Claire began eating in the common area, though she sat alone. She observed others, listened to conversations, but remained separate. She felt as though she existed in a parallel space, present, but untouchable. The staff was kind. A counselor, named Denise, checked on her daily, never intrusive, always available. Denise offered group therapy sessions and art classes. Claire didn't attend either. She wasn't ready to hear other people's pain, nor share her own. Michael came twice more that week. On the second visit, he found her in the garden, sitting on a bench. She didn't smile when she saw him, but she didn't look away either. "You don't have to keep coming," she said. I know. Then why do you? He sat beside her. Because I want to. She shook her head. You don't know me. I know what you did. And I know you're someone I respect. Claire turned toward him then, a flicker of something darker behind her eyes. You respect me. Michael, you're a millionaire. You live in buildings I'm not allowed to step inside unless I'm cleaning them. You don't need to respect me. He didn't flinch. Money doesn't define what someone deserves, and you're wrong. I do need to respect the people in my life. That's the one thing I've learned lately that I can't forget. She stood, the movement sharp. You're going to get tired of this. What? Trying to help me, trying to be whatever it is you think I need. Michael stood too, not to challenge her, but to meet her eye to eye. I'm not trying to save you. I'm just trying not to walk away. Her jaw tightened, her fists clenched at her sides. She didn't cry, she never cried, not in front of people. Everyone walks away eventually, she said. That's just how it works. Then let me be the one who doesn't. She didn't answer, but she didn't walk away either. Later that evening, alone in her room, Claire pulled out the notebook he had given her. She opened it to the first page and stared at the blank lines. Her hand hovered over it, unsure. Then slowly she began to write. Not a letter, not a message to no one, but words to herself. I'm scared, not of being alone, but of what happens if I'm not. I don't know how to be seen without disappearing, but someone is looking and he keeps showing up. She closed the notebook and placed it beneath her pillow. That night, she slept. Not well, not deeply. But for the first time since the hospital, she slept without keeping her shoes on. And in the morning, when the light came through the blinds, she opened the window. The air was cold, but it smelled like something new, like something she might one day trust. It was just after 8 o'clock in the morning when Claire sat at the small table near the window in her room at the transitional center. The sun hadn't fully warmed the air, but the light crept in with an insistence she found both comforting and unnerving. She sipped from a mug of black coffee, instant and bitter, but hot, and stared at the blank page of her notebook. It had remained untouched since her first entry a few nights ago. Writing was something she had once done compulsively, but now, with her body no longer in crisis, the emotional weight had returned. To speak, to write, to share. These things cost her more now than they had in the fog of survival. There was a knock at the door. Not a staff knock, too hesitant for that. Claire didn't need to look to know who it was. It's open, she called, and Michael stepped inside. He carried a plain canvas tote bag. He looked like he hadn't slept much, eyes faintly lined, hair slightly tousled, but still managed to appear composed. Claire had come to recognize that about him. He wore exhaustion well, even when it was carved into his face. He placed the bag on the table and sat opposite her. What's that? She asked. A few things, he said. Stuff you might need. She opened the bag and pulled out its contents one by one. A pair of new socks, a paperback book of essays by Joan, Didion, a compact set of toiletries, and a prepaid phone with a small post-it note on the screen. On it, he'd written just 2 numbers. One was the transitional center's main line. The other was his. Claire looked at the phone for a long moment. You think I'm ready for this? I think you decide when you're ready, he replied. But I wanted you to have it. She nodded, slipping the phone back into the bag. I won't use it unless I need to. That's all right, he said. That's just so you know someone will answer. Claire's eyes flicked toward the window. You know, I used to imagine what it would feel like to have a number that meant something. Like if I lost my coat, someone would care enough to call me and return it. Now I have one, and I'm not sure I even know how to answer. Michael didn't rush to respond. He had learned that Claire didn't speak idly. When she shared something, it meant she was letting down one of her many walls. He didn't dare talk over that moment. After a while, she continued, I've been thinking about what comes next. That's good, he said. I mean, really thinking. Not just about staying clean or following the rules of the center, but what kind of person I want to be if I ever walk outside and don't look over my shoulder. Michael's face remained calm, but something behind his eyes flickered. Hope, restrained and cautious. Claire leaned forward, her hands wrapped around the coffee mug. I don't want to be someone who takes. I've spent so long needing, I forgot what it meant to offer something. I want to earn whatever comes next. You already did, he said. She looked up. How? By choosing to stay alive, he said simply. By not giving up when everything told you to. Claire stared at him, unsure how to hold that kind of praise. It didn't fit the shape of the life she knew. It sounded like something meant for someone else. And yet here he was, saying it as if it were fact. Later that afternoon, Michael returned with a different kind of offer. They sat once more by the window, a soft breeze passing through the screen. Claire's hair, newly washed and brushed back, moved gently in the current. I want to offer you something, he began, and I want you to know there's no expectation. You can say no, and it changes nothing between us. She narrowed her eyes. What kind of offer? I'd like to help you transition beyond this center, not just into another shelter or a shared facility. I've arranged for a temporary apartment, small, furnished, clean. Somewhere you can. Have space, your own key, your own rules. Claire blinked. You're offering me an apartment? He nodded. Rent's covered for a year. After that, we can talk about options. You don't owe me anything. It's a gift, not a test. Her breath caught in her throat. She stood up, walked to the window, leaned against it. Her fingers trembled on the sill. You barely know me. I know enough. She turned to face him. Why are you doing this? Michael rose from his chair. Because when I was lost, you didn't ask who I was before you helped me. You just did. This is me doing the same. Her voice dropped, strained and dry. And if I mess it up? Then we figure it out. Together. She sank back into the chair, her hands covering her face. For a long time she didn't move. Her body shook with silent sobs, tears she hadn't let fall in front of anyone since the hospital. Michael didn't approach. He didn't touch her. He just stayed. When she finally lowered her hands, her cheeks were wet and her eyes were rimmed with red, but her voice was steady. Okay, she whispered. Okay, I'll try. The next day, Michael met her at the entrance of the transitional center. She wore a second-hand coat donated by the facility, and the canvas tote was slung over her shoulder. Her steps were uncertain, but she walked with her head held higher than before. The drive to the apartment was quiet. Neither of them filled. The silence with small talk. There was no need. When they arrived, Claire paused before the door, key in hand. Her fingers hovered over the lock. Michael said nothing. She turned to him. You don't need to come in. I know, he said. She unlocked the door, stepped inside and stood still. The space was modest, a small living room, kitchenette, one bedroom, but to Claire, it might as well have been a palace. She closed the door behind her. And on the other side, for the first time in years, she exhaled without fear. Claire had not expected the quiet. She thought solitude might feel like freedom, but inside the small apartment, silence became something heavier. There were no voices in the hallway, no shuffle of feet or clatter of trays, no occasional coughs from the next bed over, no rustle of thin blankets in the dark. She had fought to escape all those things, and yet here, with a bed all her own and a door she could lock, the absence of noise was like a roar inside her chest. The apartment was clean, neatly arranged, and fully stocked. There were groceries in the fridge, milk, bread, fruit, cheese, and a note in the kitchen from Michael. He had written it on plain paper with an elegant hand. This is a beginning, not a demand. Use this space however you need. You don't owe anyone an explanation for healing. The words made her chest tighten. She folded the note carefully and slid it into the drawer beside her bed. Then she stood in the center of the living room for a long time, staring at nothing. The first few days passed slowly. Claire ventured out only to pick up her mail or take short walks around the block. The neighborhood was quiet, nestled in a stretch of South Philadelphia where brownstones lined the streets and old trees stood, like tired sentinels. It was nothing like the chaos she was used to. No one yelled, no one hurried, no one asked her what she was doing there, but that too unsettled her. She had spent years adapting to suspicion. Now, being left alone felt like unfamiliar territory. Michael checked in by phone. He never pressured her to talk, Sometimes he just texted, "Thinking of you. Hope today was kind." She rarely replied, but when she did, it was short. "Still here?" Or "Took a walk." Even so, the consistency of his messages became a quiet anchor in her day. She began cooking for herself again. The first time she turned on the stove, her hands trembled. It had been years. She burned the eggs and spilled coffee on the counter, but she cleaned it all without cursing. The small mistakes didn't make her feel like a failure. They made her feel present. She started setting goals. One day she unpacked the suitcase she had kept zipped since the shelter. Another, she sorted through the contents of her tote, throwing away old wrappers, smoothing out the edges of her notebook. One evening she walked into the corner store, bought a new toothbrush and a magazine, and managed to make eye contact with the cashier. But progress was not linear. One morning, Claire awoke with a sense of dread she couldn't explain. The walls of the apartment felt too close, the floor too quiet. She paced, opened the windows, turned on the television, turned it off. Her chest tightened, her breath shortened. Panic crept in like smoke under a door. By noon, she was sitting in the bathtub with her clothes on, the water cold, her arms wrapped tightly around her knees. She stayed like that for hours. The next day, she didn't leave the bed. Michael noticed her silence. He sent a message. "No pressure, just here if you need me." She didn't respond, but 2 days later she called him. "I thought I was doing better," she said, her voice cracked and low. "But I can't stop thinking about running. It's like my bones are programmed to disappear." Michael didn't interrupt. "I found myself standing at the door this morning, keys in hand, ready to leave everything. Just go. No destination, just away." "Did you go?" he asked, gently. "No," she whispered. "I found something in the drawer." Michael waited. "It was your note." There was silence between them, not the kind that hurt, but the kind that softened the edges of things. "I'm proud of you for staying," he said. "I don't know if I can keep staying." "You don't have to know," he replied. "You just have to decide one day at a time." She hung up shortly after. That night she sat on the floor with her notebook open, pen in hand, writing without censoring herself. She filled 5 pages before her wrist began to ache. Not all of it made sense, but every word was a thread tying her to the moment. 2 days later, she opened the closet and pulled out a blue dress she had received in a care package from the center. It was soft cotton, simple, unfamiliar. She put it on and stood in front of the mirror. Her reflection startled her, not because she didn't recognize herself, but because for the first time in years she did. Later that week, she was scheduled to meet with a counselor, someone recommended by Denise, the woman from the transitional center. Claire arrived early, sat in the waiting room with her notebook clutched like a shield. When her name was called, she hesitated for only a second before standing. In the therapist's office, surrounded by books and the faint scent of jasmine, she spoke for nearly an hour. She talked about the hospital, the letters, the fear, Michael, the night in the bathtub, the walk to the store, the silence, the shame. She didn't cry, but she didn't need to. The words themselves were enough. When she left, the counselor gave her a card. "You're already doing the hardest part," she said. "You're choosing to stay." Claire didn't believe it, not fully, but she held onto the card anyway. Back in the apartment, she sat by the window with the breeze in her hair, the city moving quietly outside. This was not a fairy tale, it was not a miracle. It was work. But it was real. And for the first time, she was not just surviving, she was beginning to live. Claire awoke that morning to the sound of quiet, not the kind that buzzed with discomfort or the heavy weight of absence, but something gentler, a calmness that suggested, for once, the world wasn't asking anything from her. The light filtered through the curtains in thin golden streaks, touching the walls with a soft invitation. She lay in bed for a moment longer than usual, watching dust motes swirl in the sunlight. For the first time in weeks, she didn't feel the instinctive urgency to move, to defend, to anticipate. She rose, slipped her feet into the donated slippers by the bed, and shuffled into the small kitchen to make coffee. The kettle whistled softly, and she poured the water with the kind of reverence that only someone who had gone without could understand. As she sat at the table with her chipped mug, she looked toward the door and noticed a small package that hadn't been there the night before. It was square, wrapped in plain brown paper, with her name written in blue ink across the top. Claire. No address, no postage, just her name. She stared at it for several minutes before reaching forward, heart thudding gently in her chest. Something about it made her breath catch, not from fear but from the unknown. Carefully she peeled away the paper, revealing a small blue box, the kind used in fine gift shops. It felt out of place in her modest kitchen, almost too beautiful to belong. Inside the box, nestled in dark velvet, was a single brass key attached to a delicate chain, and underneath it, a folded piece of paper. Her fingers trembled slightly as she unfolded it. "You gave me $2. I'm giving you a world. This key opens a place that is yours, legally and fully. No strings, no rent, no deadline. I bought it in your name, because I believe in your right to stay always, Michael." Claire sat back, the note in one hand, the key in the other. Her breath grew shallow, then full again. She looked around the apartment, the borrowed space that had sheltered her in transition, and for the first time she realized that something greater had shifted. This wasn't just a helping hand or a temporary reprieve. This was permanence. A statement. A place that didn't rely on her behavior, her worthiness, her ability to pay or perform. It was hers. Tears welled in her eyes, hot and disorienting. She tried to suppress them, to blink them away, but they came anyway. Her shoulders shook as she wept into her hands, the kind of sobbing that only comes when the body is allowed to believe finally that it is safe. When the storm passed, she stood up slowly, gathered the key and the note, and placed them on her nightstand. She didn't rush to find the address or demand details. She let the gesture sit beside her heart for the day, carrying it like a candle through the quiet spaces of her apartment. That afternoon, Michael called, not to ask how she felt or to mention the gift, just to say he'd be in the neighborhood and could stop by if she felt like company. Claire answered, voice still raw but steady. "Come." When he arrived, she opened the door before he could knock. He held a grocery bag in one arm, soup, bread, apples, and a bottle of orange juice. She took it from him and set it on the kitchen counter without speaking. Then she turned to face him, her expression unreadable. "You shouldn't have done that," she said. Michael didn't look away. "I know. I'm not someone who knows how to receive things like that. I know. And yet you did it anyway." "Yes," he said simply. Claire exhaled and shook her head. "You're infuriating." Michael smiled slightly. "I've been called worse." She turned her back to him and walked to the window. "It's just, I spent so long being nothing. No name on leases, no spot at a table, no address to write on forms. And now you hand me this place, like it's normal." "It should be normal," he said. "You deserve a home, not just shelter. A home." Claire didn't respond for a long while. The silence hung between them like something sacred. Then she turned, eyes fierce but wet. "You're not fixing me, Michael." "I'm not trying to," he replied. "I'm just walking beside you." She moved closer, the distance between them shrinking to something vulnerable. "Then walk with me tomorrow." "Where?" "To the address on the deed," she said. "If I'm going to have a place, I want to see it with you." Michael nodded. "Of course." They spent the evening together in silence. He didn't stay long, just long enough to warm some soup, eat beside her and wash the dishes after. She didn't stop him. When he left, she watched him go from the window, the key now hanging around her neck on the chain he'd chosen. The next morning, they walked together down quiet streets until they reached a small brick building with ivy growing along the side and a red door that seemed to glow under the morning light. It wasn't grand, it wasn't expensive, but it was beautiful in its simplicity. Claire held the key in her hand for a long moment, then slowly slid it into the lock. It turned without resistance. The door opened into a small studio with polished floors, bright windows, and a scent of fresh paint. There was a couch against one wall, a bookshelf already filled with paperbacks, and a kitchen with clean appliances. On the counter sat a vase, with 2 daisies inside. Claire stepped inside, then stopped, overwhelmed. Michael waited at the door. "This is yours," he said quietly. "Every inch." She turned to him, eyes wide and wet. "I've never had my name on anything. Now you do." She walked into the room, touched the walls, opened cabinets, sat on the couch. Then she stood up, walked over to him, and, without hesitation, hugged him. Fully, strongly, like she had finally found something that didn't vanish when she reached for it. "Thank you," she whispered. "Not just for the apartment, for staying." Michael said nothing, he just held on. The news of Claire's story spread slowly at first, like the early light before sunrise, gentle, almost imperceptible. It started with a conversation in a waiting room at the transitional center, where a volunteer had heard about the woman who once gave away her last $2 and was now rebuilding her life. From there, it passed to a community outreach coordinator at a local shelter, and soon enough, Claire's story reached the ears of someone at a non-profit called Voices of the City, an organization dedicated to amplifying narratives from people who had survived homelessness. They called her not with demands or expectations, but with a quiet request. Would she be willing to speak at one of their events? It was a small gathering, just a few dozen people, most of them outreach workers, social program leaders, or individuals who had experienced similar struggles. No cameras, no microphones, no stage lights, just a room, a circle of chairs, and a shared commitment to listening. Claire said no the first time. She wasn't ready. She wasn't sure she ever would be. But the request lingered in her mind, not because she craved attention, but because she knew deep down that the act of speaking could be an offering. Her voice, once silenced by years of neglect, might become a small bridge for someone else still lost in the noise. 2 weeks later, she called them back and said yes. The event was held in a modest community center near Kensington, in a room that smelled of coffee and linoleum cleaner. Michael offered to drive her, but she declined. She wanted to walk there herself. She wanted to arrive under her own power. When she entered the room, she was greeted not with fanfare, but with gentle nods and kind eyes. There was no pedestal, no expectation, just people who knew what it meant to hurt, to rebuild, to be unseen, and then find a way back. Claire sat in the circle and waited her turn. When it came, she stood slowly, holding a small sheet of notes, not a speech, just reminders in case her thoughts scattered. But when she began to speak, the paper remained folded in her hand. "My name is Claire," she said, her voice strong, steady, "and for a long time I thought I had disappeared." There was silence, the kind of silence that listens. "I lived in this city for years, on benches, in shelters, in corners no one sees unless they trip over you. I had no phone, no address, no ID. I had nothing that made me count." She paused, taking a breath. "But I wasn't invisible. I thought I was, but I wasn't. One day, I gave away the last $2 I had to a man who couldn't get a cab. I didn't know him. He didn't know me. I didn't expect anything. I just didn't want to feel invisible for one more minute." She looked around the room. No one moved. Some had tears in their eyes. That man came back. He looked for me. He found me when I was too sick to stand, too tired to care. He didn't owe me anything, but he stayed. Her voice cracked, but she didn't stop. "And now I live in a place with my name on the lease. I have a bed, a key, a kitchen. I buy my own food. I water a plant. I read at night. And for the first time in a long time, I don't wake up afraid." She folded the paper, unused. "I'm not telling you this to get applause. I'm telling you because someone out there might think they've disappeared too. And I want them to know they haven't. You're not gone. You're not beyond help. You matter." She sat down, her heart thudding hard in her chest. The room stayed silent for a few seconds more, and then a quiet, respectful round of applause filled the space. Not performative, not loud, but deeply sincere. It was the kind of recognition that comes not from what someone has survived, but from what they've chosen to become. After the event, several people approached her, not with pity, but with kinship. One woman hugged her tightly, whispering that she had once spent 2 years living in her car. A young man shook her hand, saying he hadn't told anyone about his past until that night. Another asked if she'd consider coming back next month to speak again. Claire said she'd think about it. Later, as the room emptied, she noticed someone standing near the exit. He was young, maybe in his early 20s, with dark circles under his eyes and a posture that suggested he hadn't slept in a bed for a while. He approached her slowly, nervously, as if afraid she might disappear before he could speak. "Hi," he said. "I just wanted to say thank you." She offered a small smile. "For listening?" "No," he said. "For proving it's possible. I've been using for a while. I lost my place last month. I don't know how to get back." Claire looked at him carefully. "Do you want to?" He nodded, eyes glassy. "Then let's start there." She said, "Come with me." She didn't promise him miracles. She didn't hand him money. But she walked him to the front of the room where the organizers were still packing up and introduced him to one of the outreach coordinators. She stayed beside him while he filled out the intake form. She wrote her number on a napkin and gave it to him, telling him to call her if he ever felt like running. Michael arrived outside just as she was exiting the building. She didn't see him at first. She was too lost in the rhythm of her steps, too deep in the warmth of having done something that mattered. When she did notice him, she stopped short. "You said you didn't need a ride," he said, leaning against his car. "I didn't," she replied, "but you came anyway." "I just wanted to see you walk out of that room," he said. "That's all." She moved toward him, tired but glowing. "I helped someone today," she said, as if the realization had only just become real. Michael smiled. "Of course you did." Claire exhaled slowly, the night air cool against her. "Face, I think I want to do more of that." "Then that's what you'll do." She nodded, and together they walked toward the car, not to drive away from something, but toward a life still unfolding, one small kindness at a time. The apartment had changed, not in structure, not in color, but in atmosphere. What once felt like borrowed, space had begun to carry the subtle weight of belonging. Claire had hung a photograph on the wall, a black and white image of Philadelphia's skyline taken at dawn. It wasn't expensive, but it was hers. Below it, on a small shelf by the door, sat an object that had become more important than she could ever have imagined. A paper cup, the kind used for cheap coffee, containing 2 worn dollar bills tucked inside. They were not the same bills she had given to Michael that day at the corner of 18th Street. These were symbolic, gathered during one of her walks and folded with quiet reverence. Around the cup, she had placed a small frame with a handwritten note that read, "This is how it began." It served as a reminder not of poverty but of power, the kind of power that comes from kindness offered without condition. Claire had embraced her new life not with haste, but with deliberate care. She spent mornings volunteering at the outreach center, where she had once been just another name on a clipboard. At first, she only made coffee, swept the floors, and stocked supplies. Then she began sitting with the clients, listening, asking questions, telling stories when it felt appropriate. She never introduced herself as someone who had made it. Instead, she simply said, "I've been there." People responded. Not because she presented answers, but because she made them feel seen. Michael, true to his word, never stepped into her space unless invited. Their connection remained strong but never possessive. He respected her autonomy, celebrated her decisions, and cheered her quiet victories from a distance. They met often for lunch, for walks, for coffee. They spoke of books, of politics, of city noise and quiet mornings. Sometimes they didn't speak at all. Sometimes being present was enough. One afternoon, Claire received a call from the Outreach Center's director. A new initiative was forming, an internal mentorship program for individuals in transition. They wanted her to be part of it, not just as a speaker or occasional presence, but as a guide. Someone who had walked the line between despair and hope, and could help others do the same. The idea terrified her, but she said yes. Her first mentee was a young woman named Ava, barely 23, fresh out of an abusive relationship and 2 months on the street. Ava was cautious, defensive, quick to dismiss offers of help. Claire saw herself in her, the stiffness, the silence, the reluctant acceptance of food but not kindness, so she didn't force anything. She showed up again and again, in the same way Michael had shown up for her. It took 3 weeks before Ava finally asked a question that wasn't logistical. "Why are you doing this?" she asked one day, while sipping instant coffee in the center's side room. Claire replied without thinking, "Because someone once did it for me." Ava nodded, saying nothing more, but the next time they met, she brought a notebook, blank pages, waiting for a new story. Months passed, and Claire's roots deepened. She rented a larger apartment near the outreach center, one with a second bedroom she used for quiet reading and occasional guests. She planted herbs on the windowsill and attended community meetings. She learned the names of her neighbors and was invited to dinner more than once. She said yes sometimes. Not always, but more than before. Michael's visits became less frequent, but no less meaningful. Their connection, once forged in urgency, now held the gentle texture of consistency. They didn't need to define what they were. They simply existed in each other's worlds, reliable, real. One evening, Claire invited him over for dinner. She cooked soup from scratch, served it with fresh bread, and they ate on the small balcony, while the city moved below. At one point, he noticed the framed cup on the wall. "You kept it," he said, smiling. She nodded. "It keeps me grounded. Reminds me what matters." They sat in silence for a while, then Michael asked, "Do you ever miss it?" "The streets?" He nodded. Claire considered the question. "Not the danger, not the cold, but sometimes I miss the clarity. When survival is your only goal, everything else falls away. It's simple, painful but simple. And now? Now it's complicated," she said, "but it's worth it." The wind shifted, brushing past them like a whisper. The sound of distant laughter floated up from below. Later that night, Claire wrote in her notebook, "It's strange to be seen, stranger still to be believed in, but it's no longer frightening. It's a kind of freedom I didn't think existed for someone like me. And now I want to hold the door open for the next person who thinks they're too far gone." She paused, then wrote one more line. "Kindness doesn't fix everything, but it changes the map." The next morning, she returned to the center, where Ava was waiting with 2 cups of coffee, one for herself and one offered silently to Claire. They walked together to the small meeting room, where a circle of new faces waited. Some were anxious, some hardened, some quietly hopeful. Claire sat down, placed her coffee on the table, and met their eyes. "My name is Claire," she said, "and I know what it means to feel invisible, but I also know what it means to be seen again." And in that moment, the circle began to shift, no longer a line between giver and receiver, but a loop, unbroken. Kindness passed forward, hand to hand.